Let's talk about something we often don't think about, which is natural disasters in narcissistic relationships. Now, I thought about this video, and this obviously the thinking of this video came about after I watched and lived through Los Angeles going through our recent fires. I personally waited to post it because it was just too raw for me. And I was one of the lucky ones. My house is still standing. I had physical damage to my home, but it's still here. I didn't lose pictures and the millions of memories that a life in a house can hold. So I consider myself very fortunate. Going through a natural disaster of any kind, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, earthquakes, is unsettling. It can be traumatic, and it can result in permanent changes to a person's life. It could be loss of life, of family, of friends and people that you work with. It could be loss of a job, loss of a residence, loss of a community. You or someone close to you may be injured or hurt. Again, it could be that your child's school got damaged, your workplace is gone, and the life you once had, many of the routines, you no longer have it. A new life will come, but in the acute stage, you don't see that. People crave routine, their old rhythms, the familiar things, and those are gone. And people cope in so many different ways, and I'm seeing that now around me in Los Angeles. And in the early days after the fire, and while it was still going on, people couldn't focus on work or life. The people in the worst situations had to find places to live. They couldn't sleep. I know myself, I lost lots of nights. My phone was constantly on. You were waking up constantly to these alerts going off, wondering if you were going to have to evacuate, wondering if the fire was getting close. And then checking in and making sure that other people are okay. Some people just try to keep working. Many people have to keep working to get paid. They don't get a day off because of a disaster. And everyone is going through something. So it's hard to know where to turn. And of course, for those people who didn't lose their homes or those kinds of material losses, there's also the survivor guilt and the survivor grief piece. Everyone knows someone whose situation is worse than their own. And yet, everyone is going through something. And in the midst of all of this, your physical world has changed. Your city doesn't look the same. Disaster mental health is a real thing. It's a real issue. And many people often don't get the help that they need because they're so focused on the survivalism of the acute crisis. I mean, who has time to be sad when they have to go get clean water or wait hours to even potentially go into a neighborhood and see what they can salvage? And you know others are going through something with you, but every single person going through a disaster is in fact having a slightly different experience. So all of this is complicated. And here in Los Angeles, we're in this together. But every single person here has a different backstory. This channel, though, is a place where I talk about difficult and emotionally harmful relationships. And disasters and these kinds of events that happen can sadly take the challenges we already face in these relationships and make them far worse. When you are going through a disaster, everything is difficult. Insurance claims take forever. Things aren't open. Traffic is a mess. Life doesn't go, again, in those usual orders that we want it or need it to. So as you can imagine, this does not mix well with entitlement. And if you are navigating a narcissistic relationship and a disaster simultaneously, you are dealing with rage, the rage and irritability of someone who's used to getting their way. Listen, it doesn't matter if a person's narcissistic or not. The stress and loss of a disaster is overwhelming. And yes, narcissistic people are grieving too, the loss of their homes or things, whatever. However, their grief will often turn into rage at the situation. They'll get over-focused on who started this fire, whose fault is this, who can I blame? Everyone is mismanaging this. This is a mess. I could manage this so much better. I need to run the world. And listening to this entitled kind of talk day in and day out, where you're trying to keep a family going or get through the details of the day, it can take a painful experience and make it feel far worse. And remember, this relationship was never easy. A disaster on top of it will mean that the entitlement that the narcissistic person usually has turns into a disgruntled, aggrieved rage that never ends. Even the grandiose narcissistic folks start showing their cracks under these conditions. And instead of pitching in and trying to draw closer to the people they care about and trying to come to solutions and share emotion, they will often put more of their bandwidth into being angry. So if you're in one of these relationships, you're still doing everything as the world falls apart, but with a really irritable person coming at you all the time and somehow thinking that their story is worse than everybody else's. Another issue that may keep coming up is gaslighting. Many times in these sorts of situations where people are trying to make sense of all the data that is coming at us, do we evacuate or not? What do we take? We feel scared, that sort of things. Many narcissistic people will gaslight their partners or family members. They'll say, oh gosh, okay, come on. Yeah, I'm watching the news. We shouldn't make such a big deal of this. The media is just blowing it out of proportion. We won't need to leave. No fire is going to come here. In a way, it's like that narcissistic grandiosity can make the narcissistic person feel as though they will magically not have to deal with it. Well, the problem with that is that this can mean that for you to keep pushing and suggesting to get the family safe, like, let's pack the cars now while we have a minute. Let's get the important stuff pulled together. That you may have been made to feel crazy, or evacuating a hurricane, anything. That you're made to feel crazy, that you're resisted, that you're not cooperated with. Exactly at a time when you feel scared and stressed. And then in the wake of it, interestingly, narcissistic folks may become resentful, shame-ridden, and sullen. Saying things, especially if you lost items because you didn't get out fast enough. And then it's like, oh, I know, I'm the bad guy now for waiting too long. So there's never a time you can communicate. And as time goes on and it becomes now about cleaning up the mess, more gaslighting. Things like, you don't know what you're talking about. That's not how insurance works. Are you sure you check things correctly? And they will highlight that sense of incompetence that they believe you have. And through all of this, survivors of these relationships are managing the losses, grief, traumas, and fears raised by a disaster. Narcissistic people hate feeling out of control, and that's what disasters do to us. We feel absolutely out of control, and there is absolutely nothing we can do. No one can stop a fire. No one can stop a tornado or a hurricane. Here in Los Angeles, we couldn't magically make it rain. We couldn't stop the wind. We couldn't stop the fires. It was about stepping back, watching it happen, and watching the firefighters doing their very best at pushing this monster back. Everyone feels powerless, and that's a terrible feeling. But for many narcissistic people, again, that hits those core vulnerabilities for them and can result in more rage directed at those closest to them. So you have a multiplier on the existing disaster stress that a lot of people don't. But honestly, perhaps the hardest part to witness is the selfishness. The selfishness of a person making this about them, their loss, their inconvenience, their missed meeting, their event being canceled, their not finding the place that they want to stay that they want, etc., etc. Everyone is aggravated and anxious and fearful about the future. But healthy people recognize that we are all going through something and that it's a time to draw together the best we can to help the most vulnerable people and to keep trying to move ourselves forward. But certainly, fires, storms, whatever, these disasters aren't personal. In LA, the question might be, why did the fire have to come to my neighborhood? Why is this happening to me? The one thing we can say when it comes to fires, floods, storms, earthquakes, that they're never personal. Nature is indifferent. But you may even feel that when you're listening to a narcissistic person talk about all this, that you're listening to something delusional. When the disaster and all of the associated stuff are happening, and a narcissistic person may literally personalize what nature is doing, or the inconveniences of what follows, it can feel galling. And again, even more impactful as you deal with the trauma and the stress of the disaster. When a natural disaster happens or falls into your narcissistic relationship, it can change things forever. Some people who are in these relationships say, F this, I can't do this. When things in our lives were sort of felt regular, I made excuses. And then notice that when the world fell apart and you saw suffering all around, that the childish tantrums, the gaslighting, and the bad decision making that may have actually made the disaster worse for you may be the rock bottom. It may be the proverbial straw that breaks the back. For some folks, the disaster is an eye-opener and a time when they say enough. I lost things that mattered to me because I was being told that I was being dramatic or overreacting. So maybe now I'm just going to start speaking my mind. And that may mean that the relationship becomes more volatile, or that the narcissistic person doubles down, or maybe the narcissistic person gets up and leaves, not necessarily a bad thing, or maybe they finally just shut up. In some cases, the trauma of the disaster may result in significant mental health fallout for you, and their ongoing bad behavior may multiply the post-trauma, the anxiety, the sadness, and you may find it harder to recover from the acute effects of the disaster on your life. In some cases, it just becomes an existential wake-up call, and you start to overhaul your life, whatever that means. Everyone who is in proximity to a natural disaster struggles in their fashion, and everyone's struggles look different. The path to healing can also be quite different. It's important that you keep talking about it. Don't minimize your struggles. It's real, and yes, while other people may have it worse, your loss and fear and pain are real. The worstness of someone else's circumstance doesn't change that. If people bright side you, disengage. You don't need it. It's okay to be sad about the stuff you lost. The pictures mattered. That pair of sneakers you loved mattered. That one thing you had from a grandparent matters. That dented water bottle that you used for years matters. It's not just stuff, it's your stuff. And you will grieve it because it had meaning to you. You don't have to solve other people's problems before you focus on what you need, or the people who need you like your kids need. You will go through stages of grief. You will feel on edge. You will have trouble sleeping. You will have trouble concentrating. You may have panic attacks or debilitating anxiety. You may feel things in your body related to prior traumas. And the hard part will be that when the world gets distracted by the next thing that's happening in the news, but you are still living in the aftermath of a disaster, that can feel lonely and alienating and isolating, and that will happen too. You will see people around you all coping in different ways, and as I said, every person is having their own experience. You will cry spontaneously and feel angry at the world. You will be pissed when people complain about stuff that feels trivial. You will feel a sense of injustice. Talking, being validated, slowing down at times, getting nourishment, trying to rest or sleep when possible, creating routine as soon as possible, even if it is finding a temporary corner for a toothbrush. All of this matters. Acute stress reactions often start to lift in a few weeks, and some people may continue to have the traumatic stress reactions long beyond that. Others may find that they feel more in the world. You have to be patient with yourself. Your personal history with trauma, disaster, and other losses all play a role here. And recognize that if you are also having to navigate a narcissistic relationship and reassure someone who isn't reassuring you, and you're being made to feel foolish or weak or incompetent, or listen to selfish tantrums, or be criticized or emotionally abused, then you are trying to heal under very difficult situations. I live in LA. It's been my home for almost 35 years, and cities can feel like people to us, and the city is hurt, just as so many of you have lived through hurt cities and hometowns in the past many years. You always have to be patient with your healing because there's no right way to do this. And those so-called moments of what you might consider weakness are your humanity. The more self-compassion you have, the better. And to everyone who is healing from any one of these disasters, you almost have to chop your life into 15 minutes at a time. The rest of the story is not something we need to tell yet. And if we learned one lesson from COVID, is that the rates of relationship violence skyrocketed in the early months, people being stuck inside, all of that. These kinds of events, when people are in narcissistic relationships, the relationship fallout is often far, far worse. And the dynamics that were originally in the relationship can feel far, far worse. So for those of you who are thinking, I can't believe, I thought this maybe this disaster would be a wake-up call. How could things be worse? Sadly, it's what we'd expect. The powerlessness that the narcissistic person feels can really get played on. And they're often going to rage at the person closest to them, which is you. I hope all of you are recovering safely. And like I said, it won't just stop here in Los Angeles. Sadly, that these disasters are something that affect our world, and we'll be on to a new one, sadly, soon. But everything I'm sharing here, because I'm acutely in it, reminds me, and what I'm witnessing directly and working with people in the city on what they're going through in terms of mental health stuff is a reminder to me of what these circumstances can do. Thanks again.